December 21st, 1945. Winston Churchill was in his study when the phone rang. The war was over. Germany defeated. Japan surrendered. The world was rebuilding. And one of America's most decorated generals had just died in a hospital bed in Germany. Not from a bullet. Not from a bomb. From a car accident. At least that's what they said. Churchill listened to the news in silence. Then he hung up the phone. What he said next wasn't recorded in any official document. It wasn't broadcast on radio. It wasn't printed in newspapers. But the people in that room never forgot it. Because Churchill didn't mourn a hero. He didn't praise a fallen warrior. He said something that would haunt everyone who heard it. And what he said revealed a secret that both governments had been trying to bury. George S. Patton wasn't just a general. He was a force of nature. Aggressive, brutal, unstoppable. He believed he had fought in past lives. Roman legions, Napoleonic wars. He claimed he could remember dying on ancient battlefields. His soldiers feared him. His enemies feared him more. And the Germans? They called him Der Blutige Patton. Bloody Patton. He slapped soldiers he thought were cowards. He cursed like a demon. He wore ivory-handled revolvers and believed war was humanity's highest calling. Eisenhower called him the best tactical commander in the U.S. Army. But he was also a nightmare to manage. During World War II, Patton's Third Army tore through Europe like a chainsaw. He liberated France faster than anyone thought possible. He broke the siege at Bastogne. He crossed the Rhine while other generals were still planning. The Germans were terrified of him. They repositioned entire divisions just based on rumors of where Patton might attack next. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Patton was making enemies. Powerful ones. Not just among the Germans. Among his own allies. Churchill admired Patton's aggression. His willingness to do what others wouldn't. But he also saw something in Patton that made him uneasy. Because Patton didn't just want to defeat Germany. He wanted to keep going. Straight into the Soviet Union. And in 1945, that was the most dangerous idea a man could have. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Allies celebrated. But Patton didn't celebrate. He looked at the map. And he saw the next war. Soviet troops occupied Eastern Europe. Stalin was consolidating power. The Iron Curtain was already falling. And Patton said something that should have stayed private. He said the Allies had defeated the wrong enemy. He didn't say it once. He said it repeatedly. In meetings. In interviews. To anyone who would listen. Patton argued that Germany was broken. Finished. But the Soviet Union? That was the real threat. He wanted to rearm German soldiers. Use them to push the Soviets back. He wanted to start World War III. Immediately. While American troops were still in Europe. While the machinery of war was still running. And he didn't care who heard him. This wasn't just reckless talk. This was mutiny. President Truman was trying to negotiate with Stalin. Churchill was walking a diplomatic tightrope. And here was Patton, one of the most famous generals in the world, publicly advocating for war with America's ally. Eisenhower was furious. Truman was furious. But they couldn't just silence him. Patton was a hero. The American public loved him. So they did the next best thing. They removed him from command. In October 1945, Patton was relieved of his position leading the Third Army. They gave him a smaller job. Supervising captured German records. A desk job. For a man like Patton, it was a humiliation worse than death. He knew what it meant. He was being sidelined. Pushed out. And he didn't take it quietly. Patton started writing. He was working on his memoirs. Planning to expose everything he'd seen. The backroom deals. The betrayals. The truth about the Soviet threat. He was going to go public. And then, on December 9th, 1945, something happened. Patton was in Germany. Near Mannheim. He decided to go hunting. Pheasant hunting. A brief escape from the frustration of his new assignment. His driver, a young private named Horace Woodring, was at the wheel of a 1939 Cadillac limousine. They were on a rural road. Light traffic. And then, Out of nowhere, a U.S. Army truck pulled out in front of them. The Cadillac slammed into it. The crash wasn't severe. Both vehicles were damaged but intact. Woodring was fine. The other driver was fine. But Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. His head had struck a metal partition inside the car. A freak injury, almost surgically precise. He was rushed to a military hospital in Heidelberg. For 12 days he lingered, conscious, alert, but unable to move. And then, on December 21st, he died. Pulmonary embolism. A blood clot. At least that's what the official report said. But almost immediately questions emerged. Why was the truck driver never punished? Why was he transferred out of Germany within days? Why were there no photographs of the accident scene? Why was the Cadillac destroyed so quickly? And why did Patton, in his final days, tell visitors that he believed the accident wasn't an accident? He said he thought he'd been silenced. His wife, Beatrice, believed it too. She spent years demanding an investigation. But nothing ever came of it. The official story remained, tragic accident. Nothing more. When Churchill heard the news, he was with several aides in his study at Chartwell. They expected him to say something about Patton's bravery, his victories, his legacy. But Churchill was quiet for a long moment. And then he said something that made everyone in the room go cold. They've killed him. Not he died. Not what a tragedy. They've killed him. One of his aides asked what he meant. Churchill didn't elaborate. He waved the question away. But years later, one of those aides recounted the story. And it's been whispered about ever since. Because Churchill knew. He knew how dangerous Patton had become. Not to the enemy, to the alliance. Churchill himself had complicated feelings about the Soviets. In public, he worked with Stalin. He had to. The war depended on it. But privately, he was terrified of Soviet expansion. In fact, just months after Germany surrendered, Churchill ordered British military planners to draw up Operation Unthinkable, a secret plan to attack the Soviet Union. It was never executed. It was deemed suicidal. But the fact that Churchill even considered it shows he understood Patton's concerns. So when Patton died under suspicious circumstances, Churchill didn't buy the official story. And his reaction that day, "They've killed him," wasn't shock. It was confirmation. Because Churchill understood how power worked, how empires protected themselves. And he understood that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't your enemies. They're the ones on your own side who refuse to play the game. Here's what we know. The Army's investigation into Patton's death was brief, cursory. The truck driver's name was never released to the public. His testimony was never published. The Cadillac was dismantled and scrapped. No independent analysis was ever done. And Patton's medical records from those final 12 days? Sealed for decades. When they were finally released, key pages were missing. In the 1970s, a former U.S. intelligence agent named Douglas Bazata came forward. He claimed he had been ordered to assassinate Patton. Not to kill him outright, but to stage an accident. Bazata said he caused the crash. And that later, when Patton didn't die, Soviet agents finished the job at the hospital. Was he telling the truth? Or was he a conspiracy theorist looking for attention? We don't know. But what we do know is that Patton's death was extremely convenient for a lot of powerful people. Truman didn't have to deal with a rogue general anymore. Stalin didn't have to worry about an American commander advocating for war. And the fragile post-war alliance could continue without Patton's inflammatory rhetoric. Whether or not it was murder, the result was the same. Patton was silenced. And the Soviet threat he warned about came true. The Cold War, the Berlin Wall, Korea, Vietnam, decades of tension. Everything Patton predicted happened. And historians have spent years debating, what if they had listened to him? What if instead of sidelining him, they had taken his warnings seriously? Would the Cold War have been shorter? Or would it have turned nuclear? We'll never know, because Patton died before he could finish his memoirs, before he could tell his side of the story. Churchill outlived Patton by 20 years. He never publicly spoke about his reaction to Patton's death. But in his later writings, he made his feelings about the Soviets clear. In 1946, less than a year after Patton died, Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. He warned the world about Soviet expansion, about the threat to freedom. It was everything Patton had been saying. But when Patton said it, he was silenced. When Churchill said it, the world listened. And that's the tragedy of Patton's story. He was right about the Soviets, about the threat, but he was too loud, too reckless, too uncontrollable. And in the world of diplomacy and politics, being right isn't enough. You have to be useful, and Patton stopped being useful. Today, Patton is remembered as one of America's greatest generals. There are statues, museums, movies, but the uncomfortable questions about his death remain. And Churchill's words that day, "They've killed him," echo through history, because whether or not Patton was murdered, one thing is clear. He was dangerous, not because of what he did on the battlefield, but because of what he was willing to say off it. So when Churchill heard that Patton had died, he didn't mourn a warrior. He mourned a truth-teller, a man who saw what was coming and refused to stay quiet. And in that moment, Churchill knew the world had just lost someone it couldn't afford to lose. But more than that, it had lost him in a way that sent a message to anyone else who might think about speaking out. George S. Patton died in a hospital bed in Germany, paralyzed, helpless, the man who had charged across Europe, who had led armies, who had stared down death 1,000 times, killed by a car accident, or something worse. And when Churchill heard the news, he understood immediately, because he lived in the same world Patton did, a world where the truth is dangerous, and the people who speak it don't always survive.